Now, it doesn't make sense for the three superpowers to really try to destroy each other. Just trying that would weaken them to a point where they would lose their status. And you would see smaller empires try to become serious players, such as Japan, France, Turkey. They would all love to become global players. So the ideal situation for the three superpowers would be a cartel. And that sort of cartel may be formed in the near future. It may have been formed a while ago, or this cartel may have existed for a very long time. Now, if we apply the conventional view of the superpowers, they're separate from each other, they want to destroy each other, they would try everything to become the sole ruler of the world. If we apply that stereo view, what would we expect to see? We would expect to see a high level of discipline, especially when it comes to the military and military spending, right? But with Russia, it has become very, very clear that the corruption is so bad, it affects even basic functions of the Russian military. Nothing really quite works the way it should work. So the soldiers are usually very young, very poor, malnourished, alcoholics, very low level of education. Military officers tend to steal everything that is not bolted down. And when you go up the ranks, when you look at the higher officials, higher military officers, they will try to steal as much as they can, be it simple equipment, be it advanced equipment. We've seen that Russian tanks were shipped to Ukraine without the thermal optics and the night vision and the communication systems, radios. All these pieces, sometimes even the engines, had been taken out and sold on the black market because other countries use the same kind of tanks and they want those parts and pieces. The quality of Russian ammunition is really bad, and I'm not talking about Kalashnikov rifle ammo. I'm talking about the more sophisticated types of munitions. So a large degree of those munitions fail to detonate. They do not work as intended, which goes back to a lot of the corruption, because Russian manufacturers of those weapons, they usually operate at a loss. If you get into a position like that where you can control the production, usually you would steal anything that is not bolted down. And that has become such a huge problem for the Russians that the only thing left reliable is the nuclear arsenal. And it's even questionable how many nuclear warheads Russia can deploy around the world, because you need rockets, you need submarines, you need highly specialized airplanes. And all of these systems require many, many parts and pieces that have to be made by experienced people with sophisticated tools and sophisticated machinery. And then those machines, they need people that make them, and they need parts and pieces. So, if Russia truly wanted to take over the world, annihilate the United States, even take over China, and that sort of thing, Russia would have rather adopted an American-style system. Now, this opportunity has presented itself for a very long time. Even the Russian czars, which was the same family as the British throne, by the way, even the Russian czars played with this idea of copying the American system, this Enlightenment democracy type system, where you still have an elite. It's still based on the old Roman Empire, and this elite, let's say the upper 10%, they own most of the assets, and they run the state, they run the corporations, and so on. So it's more freedom than before, but it's not true freedom. And the regular old aristocracy in Russia prevented this type of renewal, because the czars didn't control Russia. The czars didn't control Russia completely, so they had to share power. And the regular aristocracy, they wanted to continue forever using that medieval style or even ancient world Roman style serfdom. Most citizens, they just work the fields and they produce the grain, and that grain is then collected, and it's basically money, and it's used to pay for the troops and for the luxury for the upper class. So then you had the communist phase, and that's a whole nother interesting chapter that I have studied. And no, I do not rely on standard traditional conspiracy media or anything of the sort. The communist phase, and then you had another opportunity to adopt an American-style system. Now, if you remember, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you had the robber barons in America, and you had sort of this ruling class that was really, really brazen. They were stealing all kinds of things and industries, and they had formed dynasties. They were handing the corporation down to their sons and daughters, and they would hand it over to their sons and daughters. And so this is kind of a situation that reminds us of the modern Russian oligarchs. They form dynasties and they hand over their empires to their children. And so the Russians had the opportunity, the Russians had the money to copy the American system to a certain degree. Share money with the population, invest in the population, give more freedom, have like a fake 2-party, 3-party system. So people think they're represented, people can vote, people have a choice. And then especially have economic liberties so that corporations can form, they're safe from rampant corruption and theft, and so that these corporations can then invent new things or just make things with a high degree of quality. So you have the machines, you have the parts and bits that you need to have a modern military and have an empire. That's what you would have expected if you apply the standard worldview of these empires. The medieval style empires were based on the old ancient empires such as Rome, and this sort of empire was outdated. Once science became a thing during the 1700s, and you saw the Royal Society in Britain dominating science, and they had universities and networks all over Europe, and also in the United States. When science became a thing, empires had to change. Empires could no longer afford to put 90% of their people on the fields harvesting grain, right? You needed to put people in schools, universities, and factories. They needed to invent things and make things, new products and new services and new goods. That's what modern empires needed. So you couldn't just continue like you would in the Middle Ages, because that thing just doesn't work. Now, we've seen a certain practical mindset in Russia, of course, even during the Soviet communist phase. So whatever ideological mumbo-jumbo they were proclaiming, an empire is an empire, no matter what you call it. It's always based on the ancient Roman system. So Soviets bought a lot of technology from the West, even though the West was regarded as the enemy and the devil, evil capitalism, right? But still, massive technology purchases from the West. And this made the Soviet Union possible. So they didn't really care about their own ideology. They just did whatever worked for them. But still, communism was a pretty poor system for an empire, and then you had the opportunity after 1991, the opportunity to copy the American system. That opportunity was not used, and it would have been necessary, especially for the demographics, because many people in Russia do not want to have children. The demographics are in the toilet. It's really, really bad over there, and there's a lot of lots of alcoholism and alcohol babies and that sort of thing. Lots of diseases. It's not a pretty place to live. I mean, it's been marketed recently as a Christian conservative paradise, but it's really, really not. It's just the Soviet Union with this is the Soviet Union without the Marxism-Leninism. I mean, it's still kind of a planned economy, and it's run by an elite group of KGB guys. So, Russia didn't do what you would have expected them to do. And with the United States, you saw rampant corruption in military spending, especially after 9/11. We are talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, taxpayer money, taken from the population, and then funneled into all kinds of projects. And a lot of that money ended up in the pockets of individuals. So they became criminals. They enjoyed their life. They could afford multiple houses and cars. They could send their children to elite universities and pay those tuition fees with no problem. But yeah, this corruption, this incredible corruption that has been documented by academics over and over again and reporters, this corruption significantly weakened the American military and society and defense in general. If the superpowers really, really tried to destroy each other, America would have acted differently. Okay, so having multiple houses is nice, having multiple cars is nice, and there would always have been a certain amount of corruption, right? But not that kind of a dimension of corruption. Because if you have a problem with Russia, if they are your enemy, your mortal enemy, Russia could form an alliance with China, and then you would have two enemies, and especially all the Chinese production, all those parts and pieces, that could benefit Russia, because Russia does not have that kind of industrial base. And while Russia's demographic is terrible, China has too many people. It's an empire that has too many serfs, right? And so there's an opportunity for Russia and China for mutual benefit. So you could see hundreds of thousands, even millions of Chinese troops helping Russia with certain wars, such as in Ukraine or a war against Finland or Sweden. That is not a joke, ladies and gentlemen. There is a so-called New Silk Road or Belt and Road Initiative that was built for trade, so China could move their goods everywhere, by sea, by land, by air. But all of that infrastructure that was built over the years is military grade, and the Chinese military has special access. They have special control when there's war. So all these soldiers and all this equipment could be shipped right all the way to Europe. You could see Chinese soldiers in Ukraine patrolling the streets, running internment camps in Ukraine when the war is won, to intern all those last remaining bits of resistance in Ukraine. You could see Chinese soldiers taking selfies in Finland and Sweden, standing on the fjords and in the major cities, like Stockholm, taking selfies. That could happen in the next couple of years. So, if America is faced with this threat, an alliance between Russia and China, what kind of behavior would you have expected from the American upper class, from the top 10%? You would have expected a higher level, way higher level of discipline, less corruption, better spending, and sharing more of the wealth with the general population to keep them happy, and to keep the people capable so they can produce more and do more things for the empire. But instead, you saw a gigantic amount of corruption in American military spending. And despite all this corruption, the American military still functions, other than the Russian military, because the Russians, they can't afford that type of corruption. But America still maintains a sizable force. The weapons work, they're top shelf products. The equipment works. They can project military power in almost any place in the world. But yet, we see here a study from the Brown University. We'll link it in the description below. It's a study about military spending of the American government. So, once the Afghanistan war started, after 9/11, trillions of dollars have been spent. So there's different numbers here. There's $14 trillion. And few corporations got a big part of that money. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. Is that a cartel of corporations and government? Yes, it is. But at least they make products that work in a short amount of time. And that's still kind of legal, right? If you have few corporations that kind of dominate the sort of market and they get all these government contracts, it's not really, it's not really clean, it's not really proper, but that's not even the worst part of the corruption. So when it came to logistics, you saw the Russians fail miserably in Ukraine. So logistics is the backbone of every war. You need soldiers move to a specific place. You need the vehicles to be fueled. You need people to be fed. You need all these things, right? You need to move things around. And while the Russians failed miserably in Ukraine, the Americans have mastered the art of logistics. And they became so good at it that they outsourced logistics, that the Americans outsourced logistics to corporations such as Halliburton. Then you had Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, and Cheney became CEO of Halliburton, and this is tied to Kellogg, Brown, and Root. And they figured out how to overcharge the taxpayer really, really hard. So the food was overpriced, right? So this one corporation gets a contract to feed the soldiers, and then they subcontract someone who subcontracts someone who subcontracts someone to provide the basic ingredients. And so at every step, individuals line their own pockets, and the American taxpayer paid premium prices, and what was delivered was really substandard. Electrical work in U.S. military bases, shoddy work, but taxpayer was charged premium prices. Different buildings that were put up after destruction, after the bombings. Lots of facilities had to be rebuilt for water and all kinds of things. But usually these projects were done really, really shoddily, and then you had projects that weren't even finished yet. The taxpayer was charged as if this was as if these were great buildings. So fuel was they overcharged for fuel twice as much as it should have cost. And this went on and on and on and on. The corporation called DynCorp got a deal for $20 billion. $20 billion to train Afghan police. This was supposed to transform the country, to make it more modern, to do the nation building, right? To take Afghanistan out of the Stone Age, out of this, backwardness and the destruction, and make it a real modern country. But this was a complete failure. So almost none of these people trained for that money. Almost none of them remained police officers. None of them did any of those services. The Taliban took over the country again, and over the years after 9/11, you saw a bunch of new millionaires in Afghanistan. They mostly have left the country, of course, by now. These are so-called 9/11 millionaires. So they provided services, got paid a lot of money, delivered substandard services and goods. Yeah. There are whole studies about this. There's so much money that's been wasted. If you just add a couple of these projects that were overpriced, you would have enough money that equals what the Russians spend on their entire military in an entire year. So then you have the U.S. arms industry and how much they spend on politicians and lobbying. It's billions of dollars and so many lobbyists. And when you are in a position of power, when you are a politician, you work for the government, you sit in parliament, if you vote for more military spending, you are set for life if you have the right connections. So even if you don't get reelected, you get a cozy job with a weapons manufacturer or some related company. And this may be a phony job, right? It's just on paper mostly. Or you have certain meetings, you're just the public face of the company and that sort of thing. You just travel a bunch and you have some meetings and lunch meetings and you wine and dine with people. So this is the kind of money that was spent. Estimated $290 million every day for 7,300 days. That is according to the Costs of War project of the Brown University. That's for 20 years of war and nation building in Afghanistan. Right? So this is kind of an empire just paying off its loyal officials. So this whole thing about 9/11 and we're fighting the Islamists and that sort of stuff, it was basically just a sham. It was just about grabbing more taxpayer money and stealing all that kind of money to line the pockets of people loyal to that system. So these people stay loyal, and of course they all became criminals, so they're compromised. You could destroy them easily if you have to, if they become a problem. And this was not about national security. Not in terms of the Islamic threat, and surely not in terms of the growing threat. The growing threat of Russia and China. So if these superpowers were really separate, if they really tried to destroy each other, if you apply the conventional view, America would have acted differently. There would have been corruption, but not nearly as big. There would have been discipline, and you would have seen proper spending to provide security and to just become invincible to defend against anybody, the Russians, the Chinese, or them together in a pact. Now, Russia, meanwhile, is barely functional at this point. I mean, the Ukraine war was a miserable failure so far. Now, right from the beginning, it was kind of a joke to try to take over a country like Ukraine, which is as big as France, roughly, to try to take that over with 200,000 soldiers and barely any Air Force operations. That's not happening, right? I mean, remember when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland? He used 1.5 million soldiers, and were massive. Was massive air support, right? I mean, that's a sizable number if the goal is a quick takeover. And then you need, of course, a really, really good supply chain, logistics side of it. So, yeah, it was a joke from the beginning that what Russia tried to do. The Russian Air Force was almost a no-show. And the pilots are not even properly trained. American pilots, they get way more training. And they train more complex missions. You know, it's really not that unrealistic what you saw in the new Top Gun Maverick movie when American pilots outperform foreign pilots even when the Americans are using older planes versus the enemy having modern planes. It really comes down to the pilot most of the time. So, yeah, barely anything works in the Russian military, and this problem has been known for a long time. Right, so Russian officers, they steal everything. They steal the boots of their own troops. They steal uniforms. They steal radios. They steal parts and pieces out of the tanks. Everything's sold on the black market. The money's being stolen. That's supposed to go to the soldiers as payment. Money gets stolen for the electricity and the heating for the soldiers' barracks and that sort of thing. It's ridiculous. It's unfathomable. And the higher you go up the food chain in Russia, the worse it gets. So generals, they squander hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of these generals and some of these high-ranking officials, they have mansions that cost $18 million, and the official owner is their 18-year-old daughter. That was Sergei Shoigu, who became Secretary of Defense. Right, so his 18-year-old daughter owns an $18 million mansion, and daddy's salary is only $120,000 US, or the equivalent in rubles. How can he afford this house? It's ridiculous. It's just not that kind of money to squander, right? Would be different if there was enough money around and the military was still usable, but it's not really usable. A lot of the equipment that Russia lost in the Ukraine war that got stolen or damaged, a lot of the equipment has been taken apart by NATO technicians, and they'd taken a look at every single component, every part, every piece, and what they found was that on an average of 85%, the high-tech parts came from the West. Night vision or thermal optics from France, certain types of radios, certain types of microchips, all that kind of stuff. So Russia can't even produce its own weapon system. They heavily relied on Ukraine production up until 2014, when the embargo came. And that goes back to the Soviet era. Ukraine was known for its grain production, but then the Soviets built up this industry in Ukraine and became really, really good. So they make all kinds of stuff, nuclear rockets, guidance system for the rockets. They made quality engines for Russian airplanes and helicopters. Ukraine built ships and submarines and all that stuff. Now, in 2014, with the takeover of Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine, Russia regained some of those important industrial centers, important factories. But there were still many other factory complexes that used to supply the Russian military. That was one of the reasons for this bigger invasion now, for this bigger war. And the hope was to take over the country fairly quickly, to steal that industry and to steal those technicians and to have them, to secure the future of the Russian military. Now, the Russians, they don't spend that much on their own military. I mean, if you compare the military spending of Russia to the all the European Union member states, if you compare it to America, it's really a joke what the Russians are spending. Russia is being outproduced. And there's also a really, really big quality difference. Because Western countries, they can make all the parts and pieces, and they can make things that actually work reliably, and they can make all those perfectly aligned engines and that sort of thing. And electronics and microchips and all that sort of stuff. And the Russians, they can't even make those parts and pieces. They try to find other sources, and they try to become more self-sufficient, but these plans quickly went down the toilet when it became clear that even after a couple of years, after 2014, Russian companies, they could not make enough. They couldn't make enough things, and they couldn't make them fast enough, and they couldn't make them in the desired quality. Now, I'm not one of those leftists who complain about military spending and complain about the military. I'm not a fool. I'm not saying America shouldn't have a strong military. I'm not saying America should close all its overseas bases and just let every other country do whatever they want. I'm calling for an end of the massive corruption, which endangers everybody. And I'm also telling people to look out for a possible, likely cartel of the superpowers. I mean, when you saw trillions and trillions of dollars of taxpayer money being stolen, being wasted after 9/11, the war against terror, imagine how much money will be spent in the near future, how much money will be stolen when the enemy is not Al-Qaeda, but the enemy is Russia, and the enemy will be China.